The letter arrived on the same morning the landlord's agent pounded on Elena Marsh's door demanding 2 months of unpaid rent. She stood in the narrow hallway of her small flat with the eviction notice in one hand and an unopened envelope in the other, and for a moment she could not decide which piece of paper frightened her more. The agent's knock still echoed in her ears. Coins scraped together from a tin under her bed had bought her 1 more week, nothing more. She was 26 years old, trained as a bookkeeper, and utterly without prospects since the accounting firm that employed her had closed its doors 3 months earlier. She broke the seal on the envelope with trembling fingers. The letter was written in a formal hand and carried the crest of a name she recognized only from newspapers. Duke Alistair Winthrop required a person of discretion and skill to manage a property during his absence abroad. The pay was generous. The letter did not explain why, if the pay was so generous, no one had taken the position already. Elena arrived at the solicitor's office within the hour, her coat buttoned wrong in her hurry, her ledger book clutched to her chest, as though it were proof of her worth. The solicitor, a thin man named Edmund Price, looked her over with an expression she could not read. "You understand this is not an easy post," he said. 3 managers have left Winthrop Row in the past year. 1 did not last a fortnight. "I need the work," Elena said simply, because pretending otherwise would have been a waste of both their time. Price studied her for a long moment, then slid a folder across the desk. Inside were pages of complaints, broken lease agreements, and rent ledgers with more red ink than black. "The Duke leaves for the continent in 4 days. He will not return for several months. In his absence, you would have full authority over Winthrop Row, the rents, the repairs, the tenants. He asks only for honest reports, and for the property not to fall further into ruin." Elena flipped through the folder. The handwriting of previous managers grew increasingly desperate with each entry. One had written, in the margin of a torn ledger page, that the tenants of Winthrop Row could not be reasoned with, bribed, or threatened, and that no decent person should attempt to manage them. Why does he not simply evict the difficult tenants and start again? She asked. "Because," Price said, "the Duke's father built that row for people who had nowhere else to go, and the Duke does not break promises made by dead men. He wants someone who can bring order to it, not someone who will burn it down to save themselves the trouble." Elena thought of her own empty coin tin. She thought of the eviction notice still folded in her coat pocket. She thought that whatever waited for her at Winthrop Row could not be worse than what waited for her if she refused. "I'll take the position," she said. Price did not smile, but something in his shoulders eased. The Duke wished to meet whoever accepted the post before he sailed. He is a busy man, but he made time this once. She was shown into a private room where a tall man stood facing the window, his back to the door, dressed for travel rather than for company. When he turned, Elena was struck first by how tired he looked, as though he carried the weight of obligations far heavier than one difficult property. "Miss Marsh," Duke Alistair Winthrop said, and his voice was quieter than she expected. "I understand you've read the file." "I have, Your Grace." "Then you understand what you're walking into." "I understand what is written on paper. I imagine the truth is worse." For the first time, something like the ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Honest. That's rarer than skill. In this line of work." He crossed the room and studied her the way a man studies a horse he is considering buying, not unkindly, but carefully. "The tenants of Winthrop Row are not bad people. I want that understood before you begin. They are angry people, and anger, left unanswered long enough, looks very much like defiance. My managers mistook one for the other and paid for it. What would you have me do differently?" "I would have you find out why they are angry," he said. "Everyone before you tried to force payment. No one asked what the payment was for." Elena did not fully understand what he meant, not yet, but she filed the words away as carefully as she filed numbers in a ledger. "I sail in 4 days," he continued. "I do not know precisely when I will return. Price will handle correspondence in my absence, but the row is yours to manage as you see fit. I ask only 2 things. Do not lie to me in your reports, and do not let the building fall down before I come back to it." "I can promise both," Elena said, and meant it. He studied her a moment longer, as though weighing whether to say something else, then simply nodded. "Then I wish you good fortune, Miss Marsh. You will need more of it than I can give you." 3 days later, Elena stood at the end of a narrow street, lined with tall, weathered houses, a key ring heavy in her coat pocket, and her few belongings packed into a single case. Duke Winthrop had already sailed. Winthrop Row stretched before her, its brick faces streaked with soot, its window shutters hanging at broken angles, and somewhere behind those doors, she knew, were people who had already driven away 3 managers before her. She did not know yet that within the walls of that ruined row of houses lived a woman named Margaret Hale who could turn a crowd against a stranger in the space of an afternoon, or that, hidden in the columns of the estate's ledgers, was a theft that had gone unnoticed for years, or that the true battle waiting for her had nothing to do with tenants who refused to pay, and everything to do with a manager who had never let them keep what was owed to them. She only knew that she had a key in her pocket, a ledger under her arm, and nowhere else in the world left to go but forward. She took her first step onto the cracked cobblestones of Winthrop Row, and the street seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what she would do. A door slammed somewhere down the row. A curtain twitched in a window. Voices, low and suspicious, passed word from house to house that a new manager had arrived. Elena straightened her spine, gripped her ledger tighter, and walked toward whatever waited for her. She had no way of knowing this walk would change everything, not only for the tenants of Winthrop Row, but for the Duke, who had trusted her with more than he had ever admitted, even to himself. The office assigned to the estate manager sat at the end of the row, a narrow building with a crooked sign, and a lock that stuck when she tried her key. She forced it open with a firm shove of her shoulder, and dust rose from the floor in a pale cloud as the door swung wide. Inside, the previous manager's belongings had been left in careless piles, as though the man who occupied this room before her had fled rather than departed with any dignity. She would later learn his name was Grimshaw, and that the tenants spoke it the way some people spoke of illness, with a flinch and a lowered voice. For now, she simply set her case down, opened her ledger on the dust-covered desk, and began to read through the tangled records left behind, determined to understand the truth of Winthrop Row before the row decided, once and for all, whether it would accept her. Outside, unseen by her, a woman in a gray shawl watched the office window from across the street, arms crossed, already deciding how quickly this one would break. Her name was Margaret Hale, and she had broken 3 managers before. She saw no reason a 4th would be any different. She was wrong, though it would take time, patience, and no small amount of courage from Elena Marsh before either of them understood how wrong she truly was. The first knock on Elena's office door came before she had even unpacked her case. She opened it to find a broad-shouldered man with a red face and a fist raised, as though he had been about to strike the wood again. Behind him stood 2 other tenants, their arms crossed, their expressions unreadable. "You're the new one," the man said. It was not a question. "Elena Marsh," she said, and offered her hand. He looked at it as though she had offered him a snake. "Last manager promised us a new roof on the Hollis house. Family's been sleeping under a tarp for 2 months. You planning to keep that promise, or run like the others?" Elena kept her hand steady, even as it hung unshaken in the air between them. "I don't know what promises were made before me. I only just arrived, but I intend to look at every record in that office and understand exactly what this row is owed before I ask anyone here for a single coin." The man's eyes narrowed, searching her face for the lie he expected to find. He did not find it, and that seemed to unsettle him more than if she had simply agreed to everything he demanded. "We'll see," he muttered, and turned away, the other 2 following without a word. Elena closed the door and let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. She had expected hostility. She had not expected the exhaustion beneath it, the particular weariness of people who had been promised help so many times that hope itself had become a kind of insult. She spent the rest of that first day walking the length of Winthrop Row with her ledger in hand, cataloging what she saw rather than what the previous records claimed. The Hollis house did indeed have a tarp stretched across a gap in its roof, weighted down with stones, water stains spreading across the ceiling boards visible through the open door. 2 houses down, a broken step had been patched with a plank that bowed dangerously under her foot. Windows were cracked and left unrepaired. A pump, meant to supply water to 6 houses, stood with its handle broken clean off. And yet, beneath the disrepair, Elena noticed something the ledgers had never recorded. Someone had planted a small row of flowers along one windowsill despite the crumbling brick around it, Children's chalk drawings covered a section of pavement, faded but clearly cared for. A pair of boots had been left outside a door, clean and neatly paired, waiting for a child who had likely outgrown them, left for whoever might need them next. This was not a row of people who had given up. This was a row of people who had been failed, over and over, until failure had curdled into distrust of anyone claiming to help. By evening, she returned to her office and found a folded note pushed beneath the door. The handwriting was neat, almost elegant, at odds with the harsh words it carried. You will not last the month. Save yourself the trouble and leave now, before you make promises you cannot keep like the others did. There was no signature, but Elena suspected she already knew, from the tenant's hostile visit earlier, whose circle had sent it. She sat at her desk long after dark, the single candle burning low, and opened the estate ledgers left behind by Grimshaw. The numbers did not add up cleanly. Repairs listed as completed did not match the condition of the houses she had walked through that very day. Funds allocated for the pump's repair had been recorded as spent 8 months earlier, yet the pump remained broken, its handle rusted where it had snapped. She began making a second ledger of her own, one that recorded not what Grimshaw claimed had happened, but what she could verify with her own eyes. The work was slow and careful, the kind of task she had always found calming even when everything around her felt uncertain. A soft knock interrupted her near midnight, so quiet she almost missed it. She opened the door to find a small girl standing alone on the step, no older than 8, holding a chipped teacup filled with wildflowers. Mama says you shouldn't be alone your first night, the girl said, holding the cup out. She says everyone deserves flowers, even if they're not staying long. Elena crouched down to take the offering, her throat tight in a way she had not expected. What's your name? Ivy, the girl said. Ivy Sutton. Mama's the one who does the mending on Baker's Lane. She said you looked kind, even if Mr. Bell says you'll leave like the rest. Tell your mother thank you, Elena said, and meant it more than the girl could know. Ivy nodded and disappeared back into the dark street, leaving Elena alone, with a teacup of wildflowers, and the first small proof that not every door on Winthrop Row was closed to her. She placed the flowers on her desk beside the ledger and continued working late into the night, determined that whatever came next, she would not be the kind of manager who left promises broken behind her. Morning brought a fresh trial. She woke to shouting outside her office and rushed to the window to find nearly a dozen tenants gathered in the street, voices raised, gesturing toward her door. At the center of the group stood a woman with sharp eyes and a gray shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, clearly the one directing the crowd's anger. Elena recognized her instantly as the source of the note left under her door the night before, though she had no proof of it beyond instinct. She stepped outside, chin lifted despite the churn of nerves in her stomach. I hear there are concerns, Elena said, raising her voice enough to be heard over the murmuring. I'd rather hear them plainly than through notes slipped under doors in the dark. The crowd fell silent, surprised by her directness. The woman with the gray shawl stepped forward, arms still crossed. You want to hear concerns? Fine. We've had 3 managers before you, and every one of them stood exactly where you're standing now, making the same promises. Then the roof stayed broken, the pump stayed dry, and the rent collectors kept knocking anyway. Why should we believe you're any different? You shouldn't, Elena said. Not yet. Words are cheap, and I understand you've heard too many of them already. Give me 30 days. Watch what I do rather than what I say. If I fail you as the others did, tell me so to my face, and I'll go without argument. A ripple passed through the crowd, some faces softening slightly, others remaining locked in suspicion. The woman in the gray shawl studied Elena for a long moment, clearly unaccustomed to a manager who did not simply demand obedience. 30 days, the woman repeated slowly, as though testing the weight of the offer. We'll be watching every single one of them. I would expect nothing less, Elena said. The crowd began to disperse, murmuring among themselves, though the tension in the street did not fully break. Elena watched them go, her heart pounding, aware that she had just made a promise, with far higher stakes than she had let on. 30 days to prove herself. 30 days before the row decided whether she belonged among them or would be added to the list of managers who had come and gone, leaving nothing behind but broken promises and unopened tarps over unfixed roofs. She turned back toward her office, already making a list in her mind of where to begin, aware that somewhere among the tenants watching her from behind curtained windows, the woman in the gray shawl was doing exactly the same thing, deciding precisely how and when to test her. Neither of them yet realized how much they would come to rely on each other before those 30 days were through. Margaret Hale had lived on Winthrop Row for 11 years, long enough to bury a husband, raise a son alone, and watch 4 different managers pass through that crooked little office at the end of the street. She had not intended to become the Row's unofficial voice. It had happened slowly, the way authority often does, one small act of standing up for a neighbor at a time, until the entire street simply expected her to speak first whenever trouble arrived. She did not mind the responsibility. She minded, deeply, watching good people lose hope, one broken promise at a time. She had decided, the moment she heard a new manager had been hired, that this one would be tested harder than any before her, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Kindness had been used against the tenants of Winthrop Row too many times, dressed up in soft words that dissolved the moment rent collection came due. 3 days after the confrontation in the street, Margaret organized what she privately called a demonstration, and what Elena, watching from her office window, could only describe as chaos with purpose. Nearly every tenant on the row gathered outside the estate office at exactly 9 in the morning, carrying signs made from old bedsheets and broken crates, painted with complaints in charcoal and berry juice, where proper ink could not be spared. Children banged wooden spoons against pots. An elderly man played a mournful tune on a battered fiddle, less as protest and more, it seemed, for his own entertainment. Elena stepped outside to face them, ledger in hand as always, and found Margaret standing at the front of the crowd, arms crossed, clearly waiting to see whether the new manager would retreat back inside or stand her ground. "You wanted to prove yourself in 30 days, Margaret called out over the noise. "We thought we'd help remind you what needs proving." Elena studied the crowd, the handwritten signs, the exhausted determination on every face, and made a decision that surprised even herself. "Read them to me," she said. Margaret blinked. "What?" "The signs. I can't read most of them from here, and I'd rather hear every complaint properly than guess at half of them. Read them to me, one at a time, and I'll write each one down myself." A murmur passed through the crowd, uncertain what to make of this response. Margaret hesitated only a moment before stepping forward and lifting the nearest sign. "The Hollis roof," she read aloud. 2 months under a tarp, with 3 children inside. Elena wrote it down. "The pump on Baker's Lane," called a man from the back. "Broken 8 months, and we've been paying an extra fee for its upkeep the whole time." Elena's pen paused over that one, a detail that matched exactly what she had already found suspicious in Grimshaw's ledgers. She wrote it down and underlined it twice. One by one, the tenants called out their grievances, and one by one, Elena recorded them, her expression growing more serious with each entry, rather than more defensive. By the time the crowd had exhausted its list, nearly 40 complaints filled the pages of her ledger, ranging from minor repairs to outright missing funds. She closed the ledger and looked up at the gathered crowd. "I cannot promise to fix 40 problems in 30 days, she said. "I would be lying if I claimed otherwise, and I told you already I would not lie to you. But I can promise you this. Every single complaint in this ledger will be addressed, in order of urgency, and I will report to you honestly on my progress every week, whether that progress is good or poor." "And if it's poor?" Margaret asked, her voice sharp but her eyes searching Elena's face for something beyond simple words. "Then you'll know exactly why, and exactly what stood in my way, instead of being left to wonder." The fiddle player stopped his tune. The pot-banging children fell quiet, sensing the shift in the adults around them. Margaret studied Elena for a long, silent moment, the entire street seeming to hold its breath alongside her. "Start with the Hollis roof," Margaret finally said. "A family shouldn't sleep under a tarp another night if it can be helped." "I intend to," Elena said. "I already spoke with a roofer yesterday. He can begin work tomorrow, if the estate can cover the materials." "And can it?" Margaret asked, clearly doubtful, given the state of the ledgers she had likely heard rumors about for years. Elena thought of the discrepancies she had already found, the funds marked as spent that had produced no visible repairs, and allowed herself the smallest, grim smile. "I believe the estate has more resources available than anyone has been led to think. she said. "I intend to find out exactly how much, and exactly where it has gone." Something shifted in Margaret's expression then, a flicker of surprise quickly masked by her usual guarded caution. She had not expected the new manager to hint at exactly the suspicion that had haunted the tenants for years, that their rent had never truly gone missing through their own fault, but through someone else's hands entirely. The crowd began to disperse slowly, murmuring among themselves, uncertain but no longer entirely hostile. Margaret lingered behind after the others had gone, studying Elena with new interest. "You knew about the pump fee before I said it," Margaret observed. "I saw it in your face." "I found irregularities in the ledgers last night," Elena admitted. "I wasn't certain what they meant until you confirmed them just now." "And what do you think they mean?" Elena closed her ledger carefully. "I think someone has been taking money meant for this row and keeping it for themselves, while blaming the tenants for refusing to pay what they'd already paid twice over." Margaret's jaw tightened, old anger surfacing behind her sharp eyes. "Grimshaw," she said, the name coming out like something bitter spat onto the ground. "I can't prove it yet," Elena said carefully, "but I intend to." For the first time since Elena's arrival, Margaret Hale looked at her, not as an enemy to be tested, but as someone who might, perhaps, actually be on their side. 30 days, Margaret said again, though her tone had softened considerably. "But I'll be watching every one of them closely, Miss Marsh. Don't think this changes that." "I wouldn't expect it to," Elena said. "I'd think less of you if it did." A ghost of something like respect crossed Margaret's face before she turned and walked back toward her home, leaving Elena alone in the street, with a ledger full of grievances, and a growing certainty that the true villain of Winthrop Row was not the tenants who had been called impossible to manage, but the man who had managed them last. That evening, Elena began comparing every entry in Grimshaw's records against the physical state of the row itself, house by house, repair by repair, searching for the pattern she now suspected ran through every unpaid rent and every broken promise made on Winthrop Row. She did not yet have proof, but she had a direction, and after days of feeling like a stranger walking blind through hostile territory, a direction felt like the first real victory she had won since stepping off the coach that brought her here. By the end of her first week, Elena had filled 3 notebooks with figures pulled from every ledger Grimshaw had left behind, and the picture forming from those numbers made her stomach turn. She worked by candlelight most nights, tracing each entry back to its source, checking dates against the physical repairs she had catalogued on her walks through the row. A pattern emerged with uncomfortable clarity. Funds were regularly recorded as spent on repairs that had never taken place. Maintenance fees were collected from tenants for services that existed only on paper. Even the annual inspection fee, charged to every household on Winthrop Row, appeared to have paid for an inspection that no roofer, plumber, or builder in the area had any record of performing. She began cross-referencing names, tracking down local tradesmen listed in the ledgers as having completed work on the row. The first 2 she visited had never heard of Grimshaw. The third, an elderly carpenter named Walter Finch, went pale when she showed him the entry bearing his name. "I did no such job," he said, studying the page with growing anger. "I haven't worked on Winthrop Row in over a year, and even then, it was one small repair on a fence, nothing like what's written here." "Would you be willing to state that formally, if it came to it?" Elena asked. Finch's jaw tightened. "Gladly. I don't take kindly to my name being used to steal from folks who already have little enough." Elena thanked him, and continued her search, gathering statement after statement, each one confirming what she had already begun to suspect. Grimshaw had not merely neglected the row, he had built an entire structure of false repairs and phantom expenses, using the tenants' own rent to line his pockets while blaming their supposed stubbornness for the row's decline. She returned to her office each evening, exhausted but increasingly certain, the pieces falling into place with the same satisfying precision she had once found in balancing the books of honest businesses, before circumstances had forced her into far murkier waters. On the 8th day, she requested a meeting with Margaret Hale, choosing her carefully rather than approaching the tenants as a group. She trusted, by now, that whatever she told Margaret would reach the entire row within hours, filtered through a voice the tenants already believed. Margaret arrived at the office with her arms crossed, as though bracing herself for disappointment. "I've found something," Elena said, without preamble, sliding the notebooks across her desk. "I think you should see it before I take any further steps." Margaret read through the pages slowly, her expression shifting from wariness to disbelief to something colder and harder as the truth settled over her. "He stole from us," Margaret said quietly, more to herself than to Elena. "Every year, every complaint we made about missing repairs, and he was taking the money meant to fix them and putting it straight into his own pocket." "I believe so," Elena said. "I have statements from 3 tradesmen confirming they never performed work listed under their names. I intend to gather more before I bring this formally to the Duke's solicitor." Margaret looked up sharply. "You're not going to confront him directly?" "I considered it," Elena admitted, "but I want undeniable proof first. A man capable of stealing this carefully for this long will not simply confess because I ask him to." Something in Margaret's expression shifted, a grudging respect breaking through her usual guarded suspicion. "You could have kept this to yourself. Used it quietly, taken credit for solving problems without ever telling us the truth of where the money went." "I promise not to lie to you," Elena said simply. "That includes lies of omission." Margaret closed the notebook carefully, as though it now held something precious rather than damning. "The Row has believed for years that we were the problem, that we were somehow ungrateful, or difficult, or unwilling to pay what was fair. Do you understand what it means, to finally have proof that we were right to be angry all along?" "I think I'm beginning to," Elena said. Margaret stood, tucking the notebook under her arm without asking permission, though Elena did not object. "I want to show Mr. Bell this. He's led half the anger against you these past days, thinking you'd be no different from the last 3. He deserves to know he was aiming his fury at the wrong person." "Be careful how it spreads," Elena cautioned. "If Grimshaw hears we're gathering evidence against him before we're ready, he may try to destroy what proof remains, or disappear entirely before he can be held to account." Margaret nodded slowly, understanding the weight of the warning. "I'll speak to Mr. Bell alone, and swear him to silence beyond that. The Row needs to trust you now more than ever, Miss Marsh. I think perhaps we're finally beginning to." She left the office with the notebook held carefully against her chest, and Elena watched her go, feeling for the first time since her arrival on Winthrop Row that she had found not merely an ally, but the beginning of something that might, given enough time, grow into genuine trust. That night, alone in her office, Elena drafted a careful letter to Edmund Price, laying out everything she had discovered without accusation. Only fact after fact after fact, each one building toward a conclusion she suspected the solicitor would reach on his own the moment he read it. She did not send it immediately. She wanted more proof first, enough that no one, not Price, not the Duke himself upon his return, could dismiss what had happened to the tenants of Winthrop Row as mere rumor or exaggeration. She folded the letter into her desk drawer, extinguished her candle, and lay awake long into the night, thinking of broken roofs and phantom repairs, and a man named Grimshaw who had built his comfort on the suffering of people who had trusted him to protect them. She thought, too, of the flowers Ivy Sutton had brought her that first lonely night, and Margaret Hale's grudging respect earlier that evening, and found herself, for the first time since arriving, feeling less like a stranger forced into hostile territory, and more like someone who belonged exactly where she stood. The proof would come. She was certain of it now, and when it did, Winthrop Row would finally have the truth it had been denied for far too long. The Hollis family's roof was repaired on a gray Thursday morning, and Elena stood in the street, watching the last shingle set into place, with a satisfaction that surprised her by its intensity. She had paid for the materials from her own modest savings, unwilling to wait for the estate's tangled finances to sort themselves out, while a family continued sleeping beneath a tarp. It was a risk she could not truly afford. But watching young Mrs. Hollis weep with relief at the sight of a solid roof over her children's heads told her it had been worth every coin. "You didn't have to spend your own money," Margaret said, watching from beside her, arms crossed against the morning chill. "I couldn't ask them to wait any longer while I untangled Grimshaw's mess," Elena said. "Some problems need solving now, not eventually." Margaret studied her for a long moment. "You'll bankrupt yourself trying to fix this row single-handedly. Then I'll need help," Elena said, "which is exactly what I wanted to speak with you about." She explained her plan carefully. Rather than continuing to manage repairs and rent collection alone, unable to be everywhere at once. She wanted to establish a transparent system, one where every coin collected and every coin spent was recorded publicly, visible to any tenant who wished to check it. No more sealed ledgers hidden away in a locked office. No more trust demanded without evidence to support it. "You want to post the accounts publicly," Margaret said slowly, testing the idea. "Where anyone can see them." "Exactly. If someone questions where their rent has gone, they won't need to trust my word alone. They can see the numbers themselves." Margaret considered this for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "It's not something Grimshaw would ever have allowed." "No," Elena agreed. "Which is precisely why I intend to do it." Together, they selected a wall near the estate office, and Elena mounted a simple wooden board where the row's finances would be posted weekly, updated by her own hand, open for any tenant to inspect. The first posting listed the cost of the Hollis roof repair in careful, honest figures, followed by the remaining balance in the estate's account, followed by a list of upcoming repairs prioritized by urgency. Word spread through the row quickly. Tenants gathered in small groups throughout the day, studying the board with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. By evening, Elena noticed something she had not expected. People had begun leaving small notes pinned beside the board. Not complaints this time, but suggestions. A tenant named Oliver Whitfield offered his skills as a part-time mason in exchange for reduced rent. A young mother named Charlotte Reeves offered to organize meals for elderly tenants, unable to cook for themselves, while repairs disrupted their kitchens. The row, given the smallest reason to trust, had begun offering itself back in return. Elena established a communal fund next, a small portion set aside from repair savings each week, meant to cover unexpected emergencies, without forcing any single family to bear the full cost alone. Margaret helped her explain the concept to skeptical neighbors, translating Elena's careful language into the plain, direct speech the row understood and trusted. "It's not charity," Margaret told a gathered group one afternoon, when questions arose about how the fund would be managed fairly. "It's insurance. We all pay a little, so none of us pay everything alone when trouble comes." The idea took root faster than Elena had dared hope. Within 2 weeks, nearly every household on Winthrop Row had contributed something to the fund, however small, and for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, the row began to feel less like a collection of struggling strangers, and more like a community bound together by shared purpose. Not every interaction was easy. A tenant named Harold Bell, the same man who had confronted Elena on her first day, demanding to know if she would keep the roofer's promise, remained openly skeptical, despite the evidence mounting in her favor. "Fine words and a fixed roof don't undo years of broken promises," he told her bluntly, when she attempted to discuss the fund with him directly. "I'll believe in this system of yours when I see it survive more than a month." "That's fair," Elena said, refusing to be baited into an argument she knew she could not win through words alone. "Watch it then. I won't ask you to trust anything you haven't seen proven." Bell grunted, unconvinced but no longer openly hostile, and Elena counted even that small shift as progress worth having. Late one evening, as she totaled the week's figures for the public board, Margaret appeared at her office door, something unusually thoughtful in her expression. "I've lived on this row 11 years, Margaret said, settling into the chair across from Elena's desk, without waiting for an invitation. "I've watched good people give up hope, one broken promise at a time. I never expected to watch it come back this quickly." "It's not fully repaired," Elena said carefully. "There's still so much to fix, and Grimshaw's theft to properly expose." "No," Margaret agreed. "But it's a start, and starts matter more than people give them credit for." She hesitated, then added, more quietly, "Thank you, for not being like the others." Elena set down her pen, surprised by the simple honesty of the words. "I haven't done anything extraordinary. I've only tried to do what should have been done from the beginning." "That's precisely what makes you different," Margaret said, standing to leave. "Everyone else who came here thought extraordinary effort was too much to ask for. You never once acted as though it was." She left Elena alone with her ledgers and the soft glow of a single candle, the public board outside displaying honest figures for the first time in longer than the row could remember, and somewhere down the street, in houses that had begun to feel less broken with each passing day, tenants slept a little easier than they had in years. Elena did not yet know how quickly that fragile trust would be tested, or how far Grimshaw would go once he learned his careful theft had finally been discovered. But for one quiet evening, she allowed herself simply to feel the small, hard-won satisfaction of watching a community begin, slowly and stubbornly, to heal. By the start of her 4th week on Winthrop Row, Elena noticed something she had not dared expect so soon. Rent began arriving early. Tenants who had once avoided her office entirely now knocked before their payments were even due, coins counted carefully and handed over with a directness that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with confidence that their money would finally be put to honest use. She recorded each payment on the public board, watched the balance grow steadily healthier, and felt something loosen in her chest that she had not realized had been tight since her very first day. Oliver Whitfield, the tenant who had offered his skills as a mason, arrived one morning with sleeves rolled up and tools in hand, ready to begin repairs on the crumbling front steps of 3 houses near the end of the row. He worked steadily through the following week, refusing payment beyond the reduced rent Elena had arranged, insisting the work itself was payment enough for finally seeing it done properly. Charlotte Reeves organized her promised meals for elderly tenants, turning the small communal space behind the estate office into something resembling a proper gathering place, where neighbors who had once passed each other with wary silence now shared bread and simple conversation. Elena watched the transformation with quiet amazement, recording each small victory in her ledger, alongside the larger financial figures, as though the row's slowly returning warmth deserved its own careful accounting. Margaret Hale became something close to a partner in the effort, mediating small disputes before they could grow into larger grievances, translating Elena's careful proposals into language the row trusted without hesitation. Where once Margaret had organized protests against a stranger she assumed would fail them, she now organized volunteers to help distribute repair schedules, coordinate shared resources, and settle minor disagreements over whose turn it was to use the newly repaired communal pump. "You've turned me into your assistant without ever asking," Margaret observed one afternoon, only half joking, as she helped Elena sort through a stack of repair requests. "I couldn't have managed any of this without you," Elena said honestly. "The row trusts your voice in ways it will take me years to earn on my own." "Perhaps," Margaret said, "though I think you're earning it faster than you realize." Even Harold Bell's stubborn skepticism began to soften, though he would never have admitted it outright. Elena noticed him lingering longer at the public board each week, studying the figures with an expression that had shifted from suspicion to something closer to grudging approval. When his own roof required minor repairs, he requested the work through proper channels rather than shouting complaints in the street, a small but telling shift in how he had come to see her. Not every problem resolved itself so neatly. Disputes over shared resources still arose. An early frost damaged several gardens tenants had painstakingly cultivated along their windowsills, sparking frustration that briefly threatened the fragile goodwill Elena had worked so hard to build. She addressed it directly, organizing a small effort to help replant what could be saved before winter fully set in, refusing to let a minor setback undo weeks of careful progress. Through it all, she continued her quiet investigation into Grimshaw's theft, gathering statements from tradesmen, cross-referencing dates and figures, building a case she intended to be undeniable by the time she brought it formally to Edmund Price. She kept the effort largely private, aware that word of the investigation reaching Grimshaw too soon could give him time to flee or destroy remaining evidence before justice could catch up with him. Late one evening, as she reviewed the week's completed repairs against her growing list of grievances, now steadily shrinking rather than expanding, Ivy Sutton appeared at her office door once again, this time not alone but accompanied by several other children from the row, each carrying small offerings of their own. A carved wooden bird from a boy named Peter, a drawing of the newly repaired Hollis roof from a girl no older than 6, a folded paper crane from a child whose name Elena did not yet know but resolved to learn soon. "Mama says the row feels different now," Ivy explained, arranging her offerings carefully on Elena's desk. "She says it feels like maybe things can get better after all." Elena knelt down to the children's level, throat tight with an emotion she had not expected to feel so strongly. "Tell your mothers thank you," she said, "for trusting me enough to let things get better." The children scattered back into the evening street, leaving Elena alone once more with her ledgers, her growing collection of small handmade gifts, and a steadily rising sense that Winthrop Row, once considered unmanageable by every professional who had attempted it, had simply been waiting all along for someone willing to listen rather than command. She thought, briefly, of Duke Alistair Winthrop's words before he had sailed. Everyone before you tried to force payment. No one asked what the payment was for. She understood now, more fully than she had that first day, exactly what he had meant. The tenants of Winthrop Row had never truly been the problem. They had simply needed someone willing to prove, through action rather than empty promises, that their trust would not be wasted a fourth time. She extinguished her candle that night, with the public board's figures glowing warmly in her memory. Rent arriving early, repairs steadily completed, a community slowly stitching itself back together, one honest transaction at a time. Somewhere beyond the Row, in a city she had never visited, a man named Grimshaw remained unaware that the careful theft he had built his comfort upon was steadily unraveling, thread by thread, at the hands of a bookkeeper he had never once considered a threat. He would learn soon enough, and when he did, Elena suspected, the true test of everything she had built on Winthrop Row would only just be beginning. Edmund Price read Elena's letter 3 times before setting it down on his desk, removing his spectacles, and pressing his fingers against his tired eyes. He had expected updates on Winthrop Row to arrive slowly and grudgingly, filled with excuses for another manager's failure. Instead, he found himself holding pages of meticulous evidence, statements from tradesmen, careful comparisons of ledger entries against actual repairs, all pointing toward a conclusion he had never once suspected during Grimshaw's years of management. He drafted his own letter that evening, addressed to Duke Alistair Winthrop at his current posting abroad, summarizing Elena's findings as plainly and carefully as she had presented them to him. He included, too, a brief note of his own observation, that in 6 weeks, Winthrop Row had transformed more completely than in the previous 3 years combined. The Duke's response arrived nearly a month later, delayed by the slow crossing of ships and uncertain roads, but when it finally reached Price's desk, it carried a tone the solicitor had rarely seen from his employer. "I confess I did not expect such rapid progress," the Duke had written. "I selected Miss Marsh out of necessity rather than confidence, having exhausted every other reasonable candidate. I am beginning to suspect I underestimated her considerably." Price smiled faintly at the admission, so uncharacteristic of the reserved Duke he had served for years, and continued reading. "Please inform Miss Marsh that she has my full support in pursuing whatever action is necessary regarding Grimshaw's conduct. If her evidence is as thorough as you describe, I want him held accountable fully, not merely dismissed quietly to avoid embarrassment. The tenants of Winthrop Row have suffered enough under his management. They deserve to see justice done properly." Price relayed the message to Elena within days, and she read it standing in her office, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders that she had not fully realized she had been carrying. She had worried, in her quieter moments, that pursuing formal action against Grimshaw might be seen as overstepping her temporary authority. The Duke's clear support settled that worry entirely. Weeks passed, and reports continued flowing between Winthrop Row and the Duke abroad, each one detailing further progress. The public board now displayed a steadily shrinking list of outstanding repairs. The communal fund had grown large enough to cover an unexpected emergency, when a chimney fire damaged 2 houses near the Row's northern end, the swift community response preventing what could have been a devastating loss from becoming a lasting hardship. Margaret Hale, reading over Elena's shoulder one evening as she drafted her latest report, noted with something like pride how differently the numbers read now compared to Grimshaw's tangled records from months before. "You've done in weeks what he failed to do in years," Margaret observed. "Or perhaps it's more accurate to say you've undone what he spent years causing." "I couldn't have managed any of it without the Row's trust," Elena said, setting down her pen. "Trust I very nearly lost that first week, if you'll recall." "I recall testing you rather harshly," Margaret admitted, a rare note of something like embarrassment in her voice. "I don't regret it, but I'm glad you proved yourself worth the trouble of testing." The Duke's letters, arriving steadily through Price, grew warmer with each exchange, though always carefully professional in tone. He asked increasingly specific questions, not merely about finances, but about the tenants themselves. How was the Hollis family settling into their repaired home? Had Harold Bell's stubborn skepticism softened at all? What had become of the elderly fiddle player Elena had mentioned briefly in an earlier report? the one who had played his mournful tune during that first chaotic protest outside her office. Price, reading these increasingly personal inquiries with quiet amusement, began to suspect his employer's interest in Winthrop Row had grown into something beyond mere professional oversight, though he was far too discreet to say so directly in his replies. Elena, unaware of Price's private observations, simply continued answering each question honestly and thoroughly, finding a small, unexpected pleasure in describing the Row's slow transformation to a man who, despite being an ocean away, seemed genuinely invested in its success. She did not yet allow herself to consider what that growing correspondence might mean, beyond simple professional diligence. She had far too much work remaining, too many repairs still to complete, too much careful evidence still to gather against Grimshaw before she could turn her full attention toward anything else. But late one evening, rereading the Duke's latest letter by candlelight, she found herself lingering longer than necessary over his closing words. I find myself increasingly eager to see Winthrop Row again, though I suspect it is not merely curiosity about the property drawing my attention homeward. She set the letter down carefully, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the modest fire burning in her small office hearth, and told herself firmly that such thoughts were premature, distractions from work that still demanded her full attention. Outside her window, the Row slept peacefully, roofs repaired, pump flowing freely, a community steadily healing from years of neglect and theft. Somewhere across the ocean, a duke who had once selected her out of simple necessity now found himself counting the weeks until his return, with an eagerness he had not expected to feel. And somewhere far closer, unaware that his careful theft had already been thoroughly exposed, a man named Grimshaw continued his quiet life, blissfully ignorant of the reckoning steadily approaching him. Word reached Grimshaw on a rainy afternoon, delivered by a former acquaintance who still maintained connections among the estate's tradesmen circles. He listened with growing alarm as the man described statements being gathered against him, tradesmen confirming they had never performed the work he had claimed, a new manager methodically building a case that threatened to expose years of carefully hidden theft. His first instinct was panic, quickly replaced by cold calculation. If Elena Marsh's evidence became public before he could counter it, he faced not merely dismissal but formal prosecution, the loss of everything he had quietly accumulated through his years of careful deception. He arrived at Winthrop Row 2 days later, uninvited, his expression carefully arranged into wounded innocence as he approached tenants he had once managed with careless disregard. "I've heard troubling rumors," he told Harold Bell, choosing his audience carefully, aware of Bell's earlier skepticism toward Elena. "This new manager, spreading accusations against me to cover her own mismanagement of the estate's funds. I thought you deserved to hear the truth directly, rather than through whatever twisted version she's been telling you." Bell studied him with narrowed eyes, arms crossed in the same defensive posture he had once directed at Elena herself. "The Hollis roof got fixed within days of her arrival," he said slowly. "Took you the better part of a year to even acknowledge it was broken." "Circumstances beyond my control," Grimshaw said smoothly. "Funding delays, difficulties with tradesmen, matters far more complicated than a simple bookkeeper could understand. I fear she's oversimplified the situation to make herself appear more capable than she truly is, at my expense." Bell said nothing further, but something in his expression had shifted, old habits of suspicion resurfacing, despite weeks of growing trust in Elena's honest management. Grimshaw noticed the hesitation and pressed his advantage, moving through the Row with practiced charm, planting careful seeds of doubt among tenants whose trust in Elena, while genuine, had not yet grown deep enough to withstand a direct challenge from someone claiming greater authority. By evening, murmurs of uncertainty had begun spreading through Winthrop Row, exactly as Grimshaw had intended. Margaret Hale found Elena in her office, her expression troubled. "Grimshaw's been through the Row today," Margaret said without preamble. "Telling people you've been lying about him to hide your own failures." Elena felt a flash of alarm quickly steadied by resolve. "What are people saying?" "Some don't believe him," Margaret admitted. "But others, especially those who haven't seen your work directly, are asking questions." Bell, in particular, seemed shaken. Elena considered her options carefully. She could confront Grimshaw directly, risk an ugly public confrontation that might further muddy the truth in tenants' minds. or she could trust the evidence she had spent weeks carefully gathering, and let the row itself decide who deserved their trust. "Gather everyone tomorrow evening," Elena said finally. "I'll present everything I've found, openly, with the tradesmen's statements as proof. Let the row hear the full truth at once, rather than fragments twisted by whoever speaks loudest." Margaret nodded, already moving to spread word through the row, and Elena spent the remainder of the night organizing her evidence with meticulous care, determined that when she finally spoke, no doubt could remain in anyone's mind. The following evening, nearly the entire row gathered in the small communal space Charlotte Reeves had helped establish, tenants filling every available seat and lining the walls beyond, murmurs of uncertainty rippling through the crowd as Elena stepped forward with her carefully organized notebooks. Grimshaw had arrived as well, uninvited but unwilling to miss what he clearly hoped would become his opportunity to discredit her publicly. He stood near the back, arms crossed, expression carefully composed into righteous confidence. Elena began methodically, laying out each discrepancy she had discovered, each phantom repair recorded in Grimshaw's ledgers that had never actually occurred. She called forward Walter Finch, who had traveled from his workshop specifically to confirm in person that his name had been falsely used to justify payments for work he had never performed. 2 other tradesmen followed, each confirming similar deceptions, their testimony steady and unwavering, despite Grimshaw's increasingly agitated protests from the back of the room. "This is absurd," Grimshaw finally burst out, unable to contain himself further. "She's coached these men, paid them to lie on her behalf, desperate to cover her own incompetence with false accusations against an honest servant of this estate." "I have paid no one," Elena said calmly, turning to face him directly for the first time. "I have simply asked honest men to confirm honest truths. If you believe otherwise, I welcome you to explain, right now, before everyone gathered here, exactly where the funds recorded for these phantom repairs actually went." Silence fell over the room, all eyes turning toward Grimshaw, who found himself, for the first time in years, without a ready lie prepared to answer such a direct question. Margaret Hale stepped forward then, her voice cutting through the tension, with the same sharp authority she had once used to organize protests against Elena herself, now turned entirely against the man who had truly wronged them. "I've watched this woman spend her own savings fixing a family's roof before her wages had even fully arrived," Margaret said, addressing the gathered crowd rather than Grimshaw directly. "I've watched her post every coin of the estate's finances publicly, where any of us could check her honesty for ourselves. You," she turned finally to face Grimshaw, "never once offered us that same transparency, because you had far too much to hide." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, tenants nodding, old suspicions about Grimshaw's years of neglect finally crystallizing into open recognition of what had truly happened to their rent all along. Grimshaw, sensing the room turning decisively against him, attempted one final desperate protest before realizing the futility of continuing. He left Winthrop Row that evening under a cloud of open hostility, the row's collective anger, once misdirected at difficult tenants and unmanageable circumstances, finally settling squarely where it had always belonged. Elena watched him go, feeling not triumph exactly, but a quiet, settled relief that the truth had finally been allowed to stand fully in the light, without doubt or distortion clouding it any longer. "That's the last we'll see of him," Margaret said, standing beside her as the crowd slowly dispersed, tenants murmuring amongst themselves with a new clarity about everything that had happened to their row over the years. "I hope so," Elena said, "though I intend to make certain of it formally, once the Duke returns." Margaret studied her for a long moment, something warm and genuine in her expression that had been entirely absent during their first tense encounters weeks earlier. "You've given this row something it hasn't had in years, Miss Marsh. Not just repaired roofs and honest ledgers. You've given us back the truth we always suspected but were never allowed to prove." Elena thought of the eviction notice that had once threatened to end her own tenuous stability, of Duke Winthrop's tired eyes, as he had asked her to find out why the tenants were angry, rather than simply forcing their obedience, and felt, for the first time since arriving on Winthrop Row, entirely certain she had found exactly where she belonged. News of the Duke's approaching return reached Winthrop Row nearly 3 months after Elena's arrival, carried by a brief letter from Edmund Price announcing that his ship was expected within the fortnight. Elena spent the following days preparing her final report with the same careful precision she had brought to every ledger since her first sleepless night in the estate office. She wanted the Duke to see, in clear and undeniable figures, exactly how far Winthrop Row had come, since he had entrusted it to her. Out of what he had openly admitted was more necessity than confidence. The numbers told a remarkable story on their own. Every repair from her original list of grievances had been completed. The Hollis roof, merely the first of dozens of small victories that had gradually transformed the Row from a place of broken promises into a genuine community. The communal fund, once a modest experiment, now held enough reserve to comfortably absorb unexpected emergencies without burdening any single family. Rent arrived consistently and often early, a stark contrast to the tangled, resentful non-payment that had plagued Grimshaw's years of management. Beyond the figures, though, Elena found herself wanting to capture something the numbers alone could not fully express. She added a final section to her report, describing the Row as it existed now rather than as it had existed on her arrival. She wrote of Oliver Whitfield's steady masonry work, freely given, in exchange for a fair reduction in rent. She wrote of Charlotte Reeves's communal meals, which had grown from a simple gesture toward elderly neighbors into a weekly gathering the entire Row now looked forward to. She wrote of Ivy Sutton and the other children, whose handmade gifts still decorated her office shelf, small proof that trust, once earned properly, tended to multiply rather than simply repay itself once. She wrote, too, carefully and without excessive sentiment, of Margaret Hale, whose fierce early skepticism had transformed into genuine partnership, without whom none of the Row's recovery would have been possible. News of applications began arriving as well. Families from neighboring streets who had heard of Winthrop Row's transformation and wished to secure housing there themselves. A reversal so complete from the Row's former reputation that even Elena found herself occasionally amazed by it. She began a waiting list, carefully vetted, aware that whatever came next for the Row's management, it would need to continue growing responsibly, rather than expanding too quickly, and undoing the careful trust she had spent months building. Margaret found her late one evening, finalizing the report by candlelight, and settled into the familiar chair across from Elena's desk. "You look nervous," Margaret observed. "I suppose I am," Elena admitted. "The Duke trusted me with a great deal, based on very little beyond desperation and a solicitor's recommendation. I want him to see it was trust well placed." "He'll see it the moment he sets foot on this street," Margaret said. "Any fool could see the difference." "You won't need pages of figures to prove it, though I imagine you've prepared them anyway." Elena smiled despite her nerves, gesturing toward the thick folder already assembled on her desk. "Thoroughly, yes." Margaret studied her for a long moment, something thoughtful in her expression. "What happens to you, once he's returned? Does your position end, now that the Row no longer needs saving from itself?" The question settled uncomfortably in Elena's chest, a possibility she had been quietly avoiding since Price's letter arrived. She had assumed, without ever fully examining the assumption, that her role had always been temporary, a stopgap solution until the Duke returned and presumably resumed more permanent arrangements for the estate's management. "I don't know," she admitted honestly. "I hadn't allowed myself to think much beyond finishing what I started here." "Perhaps you should," Margaret said gently. "This Row has grown attached to you, Miss Marsh, myself included, though it took me longer than most to admit it. I'd hate to see all of this progress handed off to some stranger the moment the Duke walks back through that gate." Elena said nothing, uncertain how to answer, the possibility of leaving Winthrop Row now feeling far heavier than it would have 3 months earlier, when she had arrived here as a desperate stranger with nothing left to lose. The following week passed in a blur of final preparations, the Row itself seeming to sense the significance of the Duke's imminent return. Tenants tidied their small gardens with extra care. Children practiced polite greetings, half in earnest and half in playful anticipation of finally meeting the mysterious Duke, whose name they had heard invoked so often in Elena's careful reports. Margaret organized a small welcome, nothing extravagant, but enough to properly mark the occasion. Elena stood outside the estate office on the morning of the Duke's expected arrival, her final report clutched carefully in her hands, the public board beside her displaying figures that told a story of transformation, more complete than she had dared hope for when she had first stepped onto these cracked cobblestones 3 months earlier. She did not yet know precisely what awaited her. whether the Duke would see her work as simply a temporary success now concluded, or as something worth continuing beyond the arrangement's original terms. She only knew that whatever happened next, she had accomplished exactly what she had promised, honestly and without a single lie along the way. A carriage appeared at the end of the street, drawing slowly closer, and the row fell into an expectant hush, tenants gathering along the cobblestones to witness the moment their Duke would finally see, with his own eyes, what had become of the property he had once considered beyond saving. Elena straightened her spine, gripped her report a little tighter, and waited to discover exactly what her 3 months of careful, honest work had truly built. The carriage stopped at the end of Winthrop Row, and for a long moment, nothing happened at all. Duke Alistair Winthrop stepped down slowly, his eyes moving across the street before him, taking in details Elena could only imagine he had spent months picturing from a distance. Freshly repaired steps, windows with unbroken glass catching the morning light, flowers planted carefully along windowsills that had once been cracked and neglected, a public board covered in careful figures, visible from where he stood, honest numbers replacing the secrecy that had once defined this place. He said nothing at first, simply walking slowly down the row, tenants stepping back respectfully to let him pass, though their expressions carried none of the wary suspicion Elena remembered from managers before her. Instead, she watched something like open pride cross the faces of people who had once been dismissed as impossible to manage, now clearly eager for their Duke to see exactly what they had built, alongside the woman he had entrusted with their care. He stopped in front of the Hollis house first, studying the solid roof that had once been nothing more than a tarp weighted down with stones. Mrs. Hollis stepped forward hesitantly, offering a small, nervous curtsy. "Your Grace," she said. "Miss Marsh had it fixed within days of arriving. We haven't slept under a leak since." The Duke studied the roof a moment longer, then turned to find Elena standing near the estate office, report still clutched carefully in her hands. Their eyes met across the small gathered crowd, and for a moment, neither of them moved. "Miss Marsh," he finally said, crossing the remaining distance between them, "I confess, Price's letters did not fully prepare me for what I would find here." "I have a complete report ready for you, Your Grace," Elena said, offering the thick folder with hands that trembled only slightly. "Every repair, every expense, every discrepancy uncovered in the previous management." He took the folder, but did not open it immediately, his attention remaining fixed on her instead. "I've read your weekly reports throughout my absence. I confess, I found myself looking forward to them more than I probably should admit." Margaret Hale stepped forward then, unable to remain silent any longer. "Your Grace, if I may, this woman spent her own savings fixing a family's roof before her first wages had even arrived. She exposed a theft that had been stealing from this row for years. She built a system so honest that any tenant here can check every coin for themselves. Whatever price you're paying her, it isn't nearly enough." The Duke's mouth curved into something close to a genuine smile, an expression Elena had not yet seen from him during their brief initial meeting months earlier. "Duly noted, Mrs. Hale. I take it you were among those who tested Miss Marsh most thoroughly upon her arrival." Margaret did not look remotely embarrassed by the accusation. Someone had to. 3 managers before her taught this row not to trust easily. "I don't regret making her prove herself. I only regret it took me longer than it should have to admit she'd already succeeded." The Duke turned back to Elena, studying her with an expression she found increasingly difficult to read, something warmer than simple professional satisfaction settling behind his tired eyes. "Walk with me," he said. "I'd like to see the rest of what you've built, and I'd rather hear it from you directly than read it in careful reports, however thorough they may be." They walked the length of Winthrop Row together, tenants falling in and out of step alongside them, each eager to share their own small piece of the row's transformation. Oliver Whitfield proudly displayed the repaired steps he had built. Charlotte Reeves invited them briefly into the communal space, where her weekly gatherings had become a cherished tradition. Ivy Sutton, unable to contain her excitement, presented the Duke with a folded paper crane identical to the ones she had once given Elena, explaining solemnly that everyone on the row made them now, as a symbol of new beginnings. By the time they reached the end of the street, the Duke had grown quiet, thoughtful, clearly processing the full scope of what had happened during his absence. "I selected you out of desperation," he finally admitted, once they had some privacy near the estate office. "I won't pretend otherwise. I had exhausted every other reasonable candidate, and Price assured me you were capable, though even he couldn't have predicted this. I understood the risk you were taking, Elena said. I'm grateful you took it anyway. I think perhaps I should be the grateful one, he said. You didn't simply manage this property, Miss Marsh. You gave these people back something they'd lost, long before Grimshaw's theft was ever uncovered. You gave them back their trust that things could actually improve, rather than simply survive. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, unaccustomed to such direct praise, particularly delivered with the quiet sincerity now evident in his expression. I only did what should have been done from the beginning. That's precisely what makes it remarkable, he said, echoing, unknowingly, words Margaret had spoken to her weeks earlier. Everyone before you assumed extraordinary effort was too much to ask. You never once treated it as anything but necessary. He hesitated then, something uncertain crossing his tired features despite his usual careful composure. I find myself in an unusual position, Miss Marsh. I intended, before my departure, to consider this a temporary arrangement, expecting to resume more conventional management of the estate upon my return. Having seen what you've built here, I no longer wish to consider it temporary at all. Are you offering me a permanent position? Elena asked, hardly daring to hope, despite Margaret's earlier reassurances that the Rowe's affection for her ran deeper than any temporary arrangement could contain. I am, he said, though I confess my reasons extend somewhat beyond simple professional necessity. He paused, seeming to gather courage for words he had clearly not planned to speak so directly. Your reports, over these months, told me a great deal about the Rowe's transformation. They also told me a great deal about you, your patience, your honesty, even when honesty was inconvenient. Your refusal to accept easy answers when harder truths needed uncovering. Elena's heart pounded, hardly daring to interpret his words as anything beyond professional appreciation, though something in his careful tone suggested otherwise. I would be honored to continue managing Winthrop Rowe permanently, she said carefully, allowing herself, just barely, to hope he meant something more by his hesitant words. I was rather hoping, the Duke said, a faint flush rising beneath his usually composed exterior, that you might consider staying for reasons beyond simply managing the property. Though I recognize this is perhaps neither the time nor place for such a conversation. Margaret, watching discreetly from a respectful distance alongside several curious tenants, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile, nudging Ivy Sutton gently and whispering something that made the young girl giggle behind her hand. Elena looked at the Duke, then at the Rowe stretching behind him, repaired roofs catching the afternoon light, a community rebuilt through nothing more extraordinary than honest effort and genuine care, and found herself smiling more freely than she had allowed herself in months. Perhaps, she said, we might discuss it properly, once the estate's business is fully settled. I would like that very much, the Duke said, and for the first time since his return, the tired weight he had carried since his departure seemed to lift entirely from his shoulders. Behind them, Winthrop Rowe continued its quiet, steady life, tenants who had once been called impossible to manage now thriving, under the simple, powerful principle Elena had brought them from her very first day. Not control, freely given trust, earned patiently and honestly, one small promise kept at a time. The Duke had given her tenants no manager before her could control. In the end, she had never needed to control them at all. She had only needed to prove, through action rather than empty words, that they deserved far better than they had ever been given. And in doing so, she had found not only a home for herself on Winthrop Rowe, but the quiet beginning of something neither she nor the Duke had expected when this unlikely arrangement first began.